Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Yashar. I'm the director of Pierce, the Princeton Institute on International and Regional Studies, and also professor in the politics department in SPIA. And I want to start off by thanking you for your patience as we were dealing with technological challenges, and to the entire staff that was helping to help us figure out how to navigate the technology. For those who are in the room, I want to welcome you to this Pierce Global Existential Challenges seminar series. This is a series we started last year, and this fall we have 4 seminars lined up. One was last month. This one is obviously focused on free speech, democracy, and ethics. And then I just want to note the 4th seminar at the end of November is kind of has a parallel. We'll continue the conversation insofar as it's focused on politics and information, digital technologies, debating peril and promise. So we can think about the debate today and then also bring it into the future conversation. I wanted to just say a few background comments, and then I'm really going to just turn it over to our speakers, because one might be thinking, free speech, what motivated us to include this actually in a seminar series on global existential challenges? And I wanted to say, by way of background, I'm a political scientist, a comparativist, who has primarily worked in and on authoritarian regimes or in new democracies. And oftentimes within that context, as we look at authoritarian regimes or new democracies, one of the primary concerns, not the only one, is to establish and defend the rights of people to have freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. Indeed, that is seen as constitutive of democracy and so much part of the debate in authoritarian regimes and new democracies. So in the 1980s and 1990s, as we saw the third wave of democracy, we oftentimes celebrated these concerns in the context of these transitions. And more recently, moving in the opposite direction with recent instances of autocratization, and here I'm thinking about moves within India and Nicaragua and the Philippines, we've monitored, we've even lamented the restrictions that have been placed on free speech and highlighted the need to defend it. After all, Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winner, has come to campus to speak to us often and is part of this year's Princeton Read. These are not just ivory tower concerns. In fact, we know that there are dire consequences when we talk about free speech and freedom of speech. People who've lost their lives, who've been imprisoned, in fact, even been stripped of citizenship and nationality. So that's one of the backgrounds for thinking about this particular panel. However, as our speakers today will also highlight, free speech is not just a concern of authoritarian regimes. We're increasingly being asked to think about freedom of speech again and its boundaries and content in democracies, indeed long-established democracies, what we allow, what we tolerate, especially when people are voicing positions with which we disagree, sometimes fundamentally, and with concerns about their implications. So one is to recognize that this is also a fundamental issue in the democracies, longstanding democracies included. It's increasingly a question as we think about new technologies and their uses and consequences. How do we think of freedom of speech in this context? And obviously, as the title notes, it's a question about ethics. What does it entail and mean? And what should the boundaries be? So today, we are really fortunate to start this conversation with 3 esteemed colleagues who have been very patient as we've been trying to get the technology working. We have 2 theorists and a computer scientist who can help us puzzle through, even wrestle with these questions. And especially given the time, I'm going to refrain from giving long bios of each of them. I'll just say they're well known to this community. They're known as phenomenal teachers on campus. They are also phenomenal scholars and public intellectuals who've written extensively about a wide range of issues, including the topic of today's panel, free speech, ethics, and democracy, although from different disciplinary vantage points. And notably, their work is both thoughtful, of course, and provocative, asking us to consider, even question our own assumptions as it relates to free speech, ethics, and democracy. So we are going to have Steve Macedo first up as the Laurence S. Rockefeller Professor of Politics and the University Center for Human Values. He will discuss elite attempts, to police misinformation under COVID. Then we will turn to our colleague on the screen, Pratap Mehta, who's also the Laurence S. Rockefeller Professor for Distinguished Teaching. He'll help us think about why we're having this discussion now and what are some of the new challenges as we think about the context and the political coalitions that support and demand free speech on a principled basis. And then we will end, excuse me, with Arvind Narayanan, Professor of Computer Science and the Director of the Center for Information Technology Policy. And he'll tackle this from the tech side, considering generative artificial intelligence, or AI, and social media. So that's the lineup. Let me give you a few housekeeping points. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we'll open up. I'm going to signal to them like this, 2 minutes, to let them know when their time is wrapping up. I want to say we're obviously experimenting with time and space on this panel. So Steve and Arvind are in person, but Pratap is joining us by Zoom, and so we're grateful for that, and we're crossing our fingers that that the technology works to our advantage now. Arvind, we were having challenges with the technology at the start. And so I just want to remind you that this is being taped, and we look forward to a thought-provoking set of presentations and a vigorous conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve. Thank you.
So especially science, journalism, universities, how well did these truth-seeking institutions perform? And our answer is not nearly as well as they should have, partly under the influence of intolerance of dissent, not enough openness to contestation around favored policies. So my time is brief. I say the book is looking at COVID as a window onto democratic dysfunction. This talk will be a snapshot of a piece of that. And I'm going to use an article that came out in August as my focal point here. It's from the Journal of the American Medical Association's Network Open. It's entitled Public Health Communication of COVID-19 Misinformation on Social Media by Physicians in the US, August 15, 2023. And some of the stuff that it describes as social media misinformation pushed by doctors is definitely misinformation, vaccine skepticism, and inaccurate reports about exaggerating the dangers of vaccines and so on. But the article is quite broad in what it considers to be misinformation, which the article laments is not being punished by medical associations or the government. The article intends to provide guidance for professional associations and governments to punish physicians for misinformation. So what it describes as misinformation includes suggestions that natural infection and recovery contribute effectively to population level or herd immunity, as well or better than vaccines, getting and recovering from the virus. And quoting, that government and public health officials withheld key information regarding COVID-19, and that, quoting again, that the virus may have originated in a laboratory in China, was part of a National Institutes of Health funded study, was leaked, and the leak was covered up by government and other public health officials. These are labeled conspiracy theories. 4, that government actors were in contact with Twitter and other social media companies, telling them what to censor and in many cases who to censor regarding COVID-19 misinformation. And finally, doubts about the effectiveness of masks and suggestion that masking imposed special costs on children. Now, the problem here is that all of these matters are subjects of reasonable disagreement. I'm not going to claim to know what the truth is on these matters, but I don't believe that the authors of this article also don't know what the truth is on these matters. So just to provide you a few particulars, on naturally acquired immunity versus vaccines, the two most important meta-studies, studies of the issue of recovery from COVID infection and vaccines conclude, and I'll quote from the first one by Piltz et al., natural immunity acquired after COVID-2 infections appears to be highly effective in terms of protection against reinfections and, more importantly, against COVID-19 serious outcomes. Efficacy from getting the disease and recovering seems to be equal or higher compared to individuals receiving 2 mRNA doses. And the second meta-study, natural immunity and 2 vaccination doses provide similar protection against symptomatic infection. And this is entirely consistent with what would have thought from previous epidemiology. There's nothing surprising about this. Number 2, did government health officials withhold important information? Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, participated in a very important forum earlier in the summer with a blogger who owns a trucking company who was a COVID policy skeptic, and the two of them have had an online discussion. And Collins made some very important revelations, or maybe confessions, during this hour and a half discussion. He said this, this is the lead science person effectively in the government, Anthony Fauci's boss, and so on. What I did was wrong, because I had plenty of these moments in television interviews where we failed to say every time there was a recommendation, guys, this is the best we can do right now. It's a good chance this is wrong. We didn't say this. We wanted to be sure people actually motivated themselves by what we said, because we wanted change to happen, in case what we said was right. But we did not admit our ignorance, and that was a profound mistake, and we lost a lot of credibility along the way. Number 3, both on misinformation and the lab, possible lab origins of the virus. In February 2020, Dr. Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance orchestrated a letter to The Lancet signed by 28 scientists professing that the virus could not have possibly come from nature, that it was of natural origin, and they all professed no conflict of interest. It turns out that Dr. Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance was funding gain-of-function research in the Wuhan lab, and 27 of the 28 authors had conflicts of interest along similar lines. More on official disinformation and virus origins and conflicts of interest. Francis Collins in May 2020, neither NIH nor NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, have ever approved any grant that would have supported gain-of-function research on coronaviruses that would have increased their transmissibility or lethality. In fact, NIH gave millions of dollars to the EcoHealth Alliance, Peter Daszak president, and from that pot of money, EcoHealth funded hundreds of thousands of dollars in subawards to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Grant applications from NIH to EcoHealth explicitly spell out work involving the creation of deadlier or more transmissible pathogens. It said that researchers would use infectious clone technology and so on to test newly created coronavirus to infect humans. 4, government officials telling social media executives what to censor and who to censor COVID-19 information. Missouri versus Biden. Nobody's paying attention to this case. The ACLU has done absolutely nothing on it. It's either government censorship or it's closely adjacent to censorship. Officials from both the Trump administration and the Biden White House pressuring social media companies to reduce the transmission of tweets and Facebook postings and so on that went against government policy. The Federal Appeals Court has said, the Appeals Court has said that the Fifth Circuit Court, which enjoined these communications, threatening to withdraw social media companies' Section 230 protection from liability if they didn't cooperate, is characterized as improperly influencing tech companies' decisions to remove or suppress posts on coronavirus and the elections. Also, some on the Hunter Biden laptop story, strangely enough. The White House likely, according to the federal courts, coerced the platforms to make their moderation decisions by way of intimidating messages and threats of adverse consequences, including the removal of Section 230 protections. These are all the emails have been released now to the public from White House officials. Masks. Anyway, the Cochrane, I'll be brief on this. The Cochrane Library has said the studies around the effectiveness of masking at the population level are doubtful. Individual, careful wearing of masks, I'm sure there are good reasons for that. Bret Stephens put it this way, there's no study that is ever perfect. None of the studies prove that proper masks, properly worn, don't work. But there's very little evidence, there's not good evidence, that they make a difference at the population level or at the aggregate level. Now, again, I'm not trying to argue that we're not arguing that we know the truth of any of these things, but all of these things are highly contested. Bret Stephens had an article, an op-ed in the New York Times. Zeynep Tufekci had an op-ed on the other side. The evidence is quite inconclusive, at least in terms of high-quality studies on the effectiveness of mask mandates, at least at the population level. And so what's being characterized as misinformation and being suggested should be punished by the government or by health authorities may have gone against the majority opinion in public health authorities and science at the time. But there were reasonable bases for all of these particular claims that I've mentioned, and they should not be condemned as misinformation. I mean, since when is it a best practice in science or liberalism to condemn the minority viewpoint and suggest on a contested issue and suggest that it should be punished? I think we defied the most basic norms of science and liberalism by not being more tolerant of disagreement around COVID. Admittedly, a lot was at stake, but doesn't that make it even more important that we try to get to the truth? Because it's hardly the case that the interventions to curb the spread of COVID were costless. So the big controversy around COVID concerned all the non-pharmaceutical interventions. We're not vaccine skeptics. The vaccines made a big difference. But it's not clear, again, at the population level, that anything else made a particularly large difference. So the school closures, the border closures, the stay-at-home orders. I mean, never in human history have governments around shut down on such a massive scale. We've never done this on such a large scale before. And there were decades of pre-pandemic plans warning that these sorts of measures would be very costly, which is consider the costs very carefully before imposing them, and that they were unlikely to be effective. Decades of pre-pandemic planning, including in 2019 reports by the World Health Organization and Johns Hopkins University. And yet, policy turned on a dime in March 2020, I think for various reasons, including class bias. It was possible for us laptop workers to work from home comfortably, and that made it much easier for us to do this. Of course, it was much more difficult for essential workers, for whom no special provisions were made for those who were elderly or with other pre-existing conditions. There were some general supports. And frankly, life was much harder for poorer people who were largely essential, mostly essential workers, and especially those with children who suffered quite a lot from the school closures. So this was the big controversy, and this was where the intolerance came in. The emblematic point is the treatment of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, as it was called, who dissented from U.S. policy, who argued for the costs of school closures and these other measures, and suggested that it might be better to pursue a policy more like Sweden's that would focus protection on the vulnerable and let the majority of not vulnerable people get back to life more like normal. Not a crazy suggestion. It turns out that Sweden did fine from COVID. And they did not impose mandates or closures or anything like the extent to which most other Western democracies did. But the response to this declaration in October 1, and by the way, there's a Stanford professor here, a Harvard professor, and an Oxford professor. Jay Bhattacharya has 160 published articles in public health. I mean, these are not cranks. And frankly, Bhattacharya is not even political. I mean, he was taken aback by the response. Francis Collins, again, sends an email message to Anthony Fauci. This is all now in the public domain. The proposal from the three fringe epidemiologists seems to be getting a lot of attention and co-signature. It needs a quick and devastating public takedown and went along those lines. I'm just going to give you one tweet by a professor of public health at Yale, just to give you some sense to remind us, but we all went through this ourselves, but of the vitriol around dissenting from blue state COVID policies. This is Greg Gonsalves, Yale School of Public Health, who actually won a MacArthur Genius Award before COVID. This is still on his Twitter feed. I'm in my mid-50s. I have HIV. I saw friends die in droves in the 80s and 90s. I have no more F-bomb coming. Fucks left to give, except those peddling pseudoscience bankrolled by right-wing libertarian assholes. That's the Great Barrington people. Can kiss my queer ass. I know you're kind. We beat you once. We'll beat you again and again on Twitter. Still up on his Twitter feed. The fucking Great Barrington Declaration is like a bad rash that just won't go away. So obviously, in the context of the polarization of 2020, this is a month before the election. Donald Trump was on the ballot. You can kind of understand that. These guys weren't taking a political stance, and it was an international a group that they had assembled. They weren't particularly thinking, according to Bhattacharya, about the American election, but criticizing blue state strategies was obviously partly seen as helping Donald Trump. Now, just very quickly, and to wrap up with this, blue state, and this is the empirical stuff here is from my colleague Francis, who's been terrific on this. Blue state and red state policies diverge widely. COVID policy tracked partisanship very strongly. Democratic, everybody closed down in March 2020. Republican states, blue states, with a couple of exceptions. Mike DeWine, Republican governor of Ohio, was the first to close the schools statewide. Big difference is partisanship in reopening and the length of closures. The California schools were mainly closed throughout the entire 2020 to 2021 school year. Most schools in Republican states opened up in the fall of 2020. So big difference in the length of stay-at-home orders and so on. Strong relationship between state partisanship and school reopening. Republican states open much faster than Democratic states. That's a very strong relationship there. No relationship between the length of school closures and COVID mortality. There's no relationship across the states. Big differences in the stringency of all of the COVID policies that I mentioned, mask mandates, school closures, business closures, stay-at-home orders, and so on and so forth. This is the overall stringency index that Oxford has put out, the Oxford Gov Department, using all these 9 measures: school closures, workplace closures, canceling public events, restricting public gatherings, stay-at-home requirements, public information, so on and so forth. You can index the 50 states by the stringency of their responses, based on this index. Again, strong relationship. We need partisanship and more stringent interventions, many of which were coercive, of course, not allowing people to go to church. Again, it's rather surprising that the ACLU has had nothing to say about any of this. Strong relationship between state partisanship and overall pandemic restrictions. No relationship between pandemic restrictions and COVID mortality. No relationship between the stringency of these interventions across the 50 states, which are laboratories of democracy, and the aggregate outcomes. Once you control for everything, of course, the age, you have to control for the most important thing, percentage of people without health insurance, and other sorts of things, or percentage urban, and also take out the states that got COVID early. They may have been outliers. Take them out, still same relationship. No relationship between pandemic restrictions and COVID mortality. Earlier stay-at-home orders not associated with lower COVID mortality. Lengthier stay-at-home orders not associated with lower COVID mortality. Partisanship also affected vaccine uptake. Again, clearly the vaccines were game changers, and COVID mortality is strongly related to vaccine uptake. So the vaccines made a big difference. It's not clear in aggregate that everything else did. And those other things were costly. We have a whole chapter on the costs of COVID. I'm just going to mention this one study on schooling in Europe. Evidence now suggests that school closures had vast consequences in terms of education loss of school-related public health efforts, such as mental health monitoring, nutritional effects, large impacts on social inequality, with these interventions disproportionately harming disadvantaged children and families. The distributive impact was malign from the standpoint of distributive justice. The rich did better, our retirement funds grew, and so on, and the poor suffered disproportionately. Conclusion: yes, social media and unfiltered access it can provide to mass audiences, plus its tendency to amplify moral outrage, furnishes new challenges for truth-seeking in the public sphere. It certainly is the case that misinformation online is a problem. How to regulate it and who can be trusted with the power to regulate speech is the problem. COVID provides dispiriting evidence of progressive elite intolerance of reasonable dissent. So it raises the question of who should we trust? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to let you take it.
Thank you so much. Pratap is next, so how do we make that happen?
Thank you. It's a great privilege being here, and thank you for taking this extra effort to include me in this wonderful conversation. I'm going to begin where Steve left off, because I think if you look at the title of this panel, ethics, free speech, ethics, and democracy, I think what's intriguing in the title of this panel is the conjunction of the 3 terms. I think the connection between free speech and democracy is obvious to most people. Most assaults on free speech end up being assaults on democracy as well, and the possibility of freely mobilizing dissent. But I think the invocation of the term ethics in the title of this panel, I think draws attention to something that I think Steve is highlighting, and will be one of the themes of what I'm going to be talking about, which is the following. Often when we think of debates over free speech and the relationship between free speech and democracy, most of the debates are at the level of the legal protections for free speech, right? And I lay my cards on the table. I tend to be as much of a free speech absolutist as one possibly can be at the level of legal, in some senses, protection for free speech. But precisely because we have in democracies at least these presumptive freedoms of various kinds, there is another ethical question that arises that can't be settled purely at a legal level, which is, what are the practices of speech that are appropriate to building a democratic world that is more deliberative, more conducive to listening, more conducive to reciprocity, empathy, integrity, and truth. So in some senses, the term ethics directs our attention to the practices of speech as much as it does to actually the legal restrictions around speech. And I think one of the most remarkable phenomena of our time in almost all democracies, at least the two democracies that I inhabit, much more so in India, perhaps in the United States, but there are parallels there, is what the status of dissent is increasingly in democracies. It used to be the case in much liberal thinking about democracy and much of the practice of democracy that dissent was a precondition for authentic consent, right? I mean, you know your consent to the truth is authentic only if there is the possibility of dissenting from it. But we seem to be in an interesting democratic moment in many contexts where dissent has become to consent what heresy is to truth in some senses, right? Which is not a kind of precondition for seeking truth, not a precondition for participating more equally and together in a democratic project, but in some senses a sign of heresy of some kind. And I think that's what I like about the title of the panel that Professor Yashar has proposed. It is directing our attention to what are those ethical practices that are appropriate to building this democratic world in common. Now, having said that, I think it is worth reminding ourselves, as Professor Yashar did, that we are in a world where a large number of democracies are backsliding on basic political rights and freedom of expression. India has at the moment 16 journalists who are being tried under anti-terror laws, which basically means they don't get even any due process. The state has just sanctioned the prosecution of Arvind Roy, India's one of India's best-known writers. A standard repertoire of laws like sedition, defamation, blasphemy, anti-blasphemy laws, laws invoking public order. This repertoire is now being interpreted in such an expansive way to consistently put freedom of expression at threat. The question that I want to put on the table, and this is really only a question that I think we require perhaps more research on, or at least more practical in this conversation, is what are the conditions under which democracies can sustain political coalitions where these kinds of assaults on civil liberties are seen to be deal breakers for the legitimacy of any government. So just to take India as an example in the moment, I think what's frightening about this moment in some ways is that many of the institutions, particularly elite institutions, that have the power to protect these basic liberties, like the courts, for example, classic anti-majoritarian institution, if it's meant for any purpose, it is meant for the protection of these kinds of liberties. Those institutions have more or less collapsed and are deferring to democratic majorities that are curtailing rights under the imprimatur of popular support. And this is what actually raises this question, right? What are the political coalitions that actually sustain political movements for protecting civil liberties? And how does one create those movements, particularly in democracies, where still a lot of the paraphernalia and repertoire of elections and political mobilization is actually still available to? And that's a question I just want to, park there. Increasingly, I'm sort of more intrigued by why isn't there more resistance, particularly in democracies that have a long history of institutionalization of these liberties. But the second context, of this discussion, and that's really, in some senses, builds on what Steve was saying, is that many democracies where the legal rights to free expression are still relatively well protected, that's arguably in the United States institutions that are certainly still working. Newspaper owners are still not being put in prison, at least for taking particular positions. There is still, nevertheless, a sense of crisis around free speech. And in summary form, I'd just like to kind of put it just as a kind of thesis out there. We don't have time to, so I don't have time to expand on this. Is one way of thinking about it is that this crisis is not so much a crisis of free speech, understood as a crisis of legal protections for free expression. If anything, many people would argue that actually there's a lot more free expression than ever. Even attempts to censor, even in authoritarian governments, so even in governments that are actually backsliding like India's, even attempts to censor have this paradoxical consequence of trying to draw attention to the thing that they're trying to censor, rather than in some sense snuff it out. I think it's one of the sort of performative kind of features of censorship in our time. It draws attention to an exercise of political power more than it is able to effectively censor away a large numbers of viewpoints. Right? But the crisis is really centered around what you might call the infrastructure of free expression. I think this is a phrase Jack Baldwin used to use. Where the infrastructure of free expression refers to a whole range of institutions where we exercise expression in different forms. Universities, religious institutions, civil society organizations, sometimes even corporations, this whole kind of paraphernalia of institutions. And one of the standard kind of accounts in liberal democracy used to be that the autonomy of these institutions is in part what sustains the infrastructure of free expression in democracies. But one of the conditions of granting them that autonomy is that those institutions are following practices of speech that are in some senses compatible with or that are intrinsic to their identity, mission, and purpose. So one of the reasons we grant academic freedom is because academic freedom is essential to the truth-seeking mission of a university. And I think one of the things that is quite striking across democracies in the world, across the world, is a deep-seated skepticism. I think Steve just gave a kind of a powerful example of that. A deep-seated skepticism, whether these autonomous institutions that claim immunities of various kinds are actually exemplars of their mission in some ways or other, right? Or are they in some ways betraying their mission because of the practices they are adopting in some ways internally? Sometimes there's even a deep contestation over what the identity and mission of many of these institutions is. Universities, for example, in some contexts, it's actually not obvious to people that truth-seeking is the highest goal of the university. I don't think we should take that fact for granted. But I think the fact, and I'm just laying that out as a kind of as a summary description, I'm not saying it's accurate, but I think the perception that a large number of these institutions, whether it's newspapers, whether it's media houses, whether it's universities and so on, are no longer exemplars of the practices under which they claim immunity from accountability. I think that sense is going quite deeply and powerful. And I think the sense has been exacerbated by one particular feature of these institutions that I think particularly pertains to the ethics of free speech. So I think the political theorist Teresa Bejan had a nice distinction that when we think of the ethics of free speech, you can think of two things, right? You can think of the freedom of expression. I have the right to say what I wish, unfettered, unencumbered by the threat of coercion or consequences that might follow, something like that. But there is a second expectation of when we claim the right to free expression, which is some kind of equal opportunity or equal right to regard or concern or be heard. This is not the right to say that all claims are equally valid, but this is a claim that actually says that in some senses a society will have robust practices of free expression where everyone feels they have equally got the chance to be, or the opportunity to be heard, at least to listen. And that one of the reasons reasons why a lot of these intermediate institutions are in crisis, their practices of free expression in crisis, is because there is a contestation over their claim to be able to give everyone equal chance to be heard, appropriate to the mission of that institution. That these institutions, to some extent, have been internally marred by a kind of power balance, where, yes, freedom of expression is important, but in practice, that freedom of expression has meant privileged access to that forum of expression for a few. Now, I don't think this is an argument for maintaining any kind of freedom of expression, but I do think this is part of a diagnosis in some ways for why there is, I think, increasing skepticism about these kinds of institutions and the infrastructure of free expression that they nourish. Certainly in countries like India, I think if you think of elite universities, I think it's a fair criticism that often the contests within universities are not seen as contests about empowering different kinds of points of view equally, giving the sense that this infrastructure of free expression belongs to everyone. It is increasingly seen as the contest over social capital between one privileged group and another privileged group. And the reason I think I'm putting that out on the table is because I think it goes to some way to, I think, explaining at least why there isn't as much investment in protecting these spaces as we used to take for granted and as any free society in some senses ought to take for granted. So a lot of the question of the ethics of free expression then turns on what we think the mission and identity of this different infrastructure of its free expression is. And how do we evolve norms and modes of expression which are considered in some senses fair, where these institutions are not considered simply as sites of empowerment of particular identities or partisan views. The last and final thing I just want to put on the table, I know Arvind is going to talk about the kind of the information order we inhabit and the challenges that this particular kind of information order poses, where you almost get the sense, I'm speaking personally, I think Steve's examples also point to that, where there is something about the fact that any expression can now be contextualized, recontextualized, and decontextualized in so many different ways that you almost feel that almost any form of communication or action in the public sphere, right, is in a sense a recipe to you being misunderstood one way or the other. And in part that comes from the fact that any occasion for expression, even if well-intentioned, becomes an occasion for competition between groups to express what is actually salient to them. Right? So you might sympathize with group X, large numbers of people take that form of expression, right, simply as an occasion to say, why aren't you sympathizing with group Y? And actually, at one level, that there is something to that claim. But it points to the difficulty, right, of creating democratic structures where different people have the sense that their claims have equal salience, or at least an equal chance of being heard. I think quite profoundly. But the most important thing, I think, at least of the Indian case, but it is probably true elsewhere, which is the single biggest threat to free expression, both at the legal level, but also at the level of ethical practice, actually does not come from the structure of the information order, the fact that information can be disseminated quickly and so forth. That certainly is one contributing factor. It actually comes from that oldest of ideologies, which is nationalism. Because nationalism, in some senses, is one of the few ideologies that can convert experience of difference into a contest over identity. It can use speech or insists that all speech, including truth-seeking speech, be used to build up antagonisms And nationalism is the one form of expression that always expresses the privilege of one particular group. And you can use the analogy of nationalism in some senses for sub-nationalism as well, or any form of group identity. But in some senses, some forms of group identity are clamoring for inclusion. But there is always that risk that arguing for your group identity in some ways, or using expression as a means for arguing for it, asserts your privilege and in some senses impedes the democratic project of equality. And so the optimistic story about this would be that actually, if you look at practices in Yashar, and what we need to diagnose is why is nationalism in some senses such a dominant discourse across the world. If we can diagnose that, we can mount a better defense of the practices of free speech. Because somewhere or the other, almost all significant threats, in my view, to freedom of expression actually come from nationalism. I'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Arvind.
Thank you, Steve and Pratap. I think those were both brilliant talks, and I learned a lot. I'm going to look at misinformation. I'm going to look at threats to democracy and ask, to what extent are these technology problems? I think that's an important question. If it is, in large part, a technology problem, then the implications are dire because technological progress is accelerating and our ability to regulate its implications for speech are perhaps not keeping up. And I've sometimes made those claims myself, but today I want to put it under a microscope. Is it really a technology problem? Is it making misinformation worse? Or is it merely reflecting deeper problems in our society? If that's the case, then fixing technology is not really going to help anything. So let me start with generative AI, because in the civil society circles that I'm part of, it's often taken as as accepted wisdom that a wave of AI-enabled deepfakes is coming, that disinformation is coming through generative AI. And let me address this through an example. The go-to example that people use is a hoax image many of you may have seen a few months ago depicting a bombing of the Pentagon. That didn't happen, of course. This was AI generated, and it caused a brief panic among the public and also among stock markets, and the stock market even dipped briefly before it was identified as a hoax. And this is seen as the first in a big wave of such threats that is coming. What I want to point out here is that even though this image happened to have been created using generative AI, AI was in no way a prerequisite for this hoax. It could have been easily created with 10 minutes of Photoshop by any Photoshop expert. Anyone, any influence actor who wanted to do this could have paid just $100 for someone to use Photoshop to do this. And in fact, since then, there have been many, many instances of fake images used for disinformation campaigns, and most of them have not involved AI. There are simple things like reusing a past photo or even footage from a video game depicted as an actual ongoing conflict, and that turns out to be enough to fool people. And this has been very surprising to me. The reason that that particular image of the Pentagon caused some panic was because it was tweeted by a blue check account on Twitter. And since people misunderstood that to be a verified account in the sense of trustworthiness, it was retweeted by a bunch of legitimate news organizations. And that is really what caused it to have some effectiveness. So this story is not really about generative AI. If we pretend that it is, we lose focus on what was actually interesting here, which is that Twitter in the last year has wrecked many important integrity features of its platform. But I don't want to, want us to come to the conclusion that this is a Twitter problem. I don't think it is. Even the grown-up platforms, in many ways, have actually rolled back a lot of their integrity efforts that they put into place in the run-up to the 2020 election. So why is that? It's my best understanding of what is going on, both from public documentation and having talked to some folks at some of these companies who are on the teams responsible for making these decisions, is that those misinformation fighting efforts don't actually seem to be working well. There are many reasons for this. I think one primary reason is the design of these social media apps and the algorithms behind them, which in many ways are promoting the kind of content that people might click on more, engage with, turns out to be misinformation more often than if the algorithms had been designed differently. So in some ways, these social media companies are fighting a monster, fighting an enemy that is partly of their own making. Now, the effect of these recommendation algorithms on various outcomes relevant to democracy and politics is it's an intensely debated question. There is a nice line of research on this, including from Andy Guess here at Princeton. But I think what is clear is that the design and algorithmic decisions that platforms make have a big effect on what kind of content is propagated, on who sees what, even if the question of what happens after that, what kind of real-world impact it has on people's attitudes, voting behavior, that is up for debate, but there is no question that design greatly influences what actually propagates on these platforms. But putting that aside, I think there's a much bigger reason why these attempts to tackle misinformation, both from the platforms, but really also coming from civil society, who in many ways are the ones pushing the platforms in this direction. There's a reason those efforts have not been working that well. I want to claim, and this is my central claim, that it is based on a fundamentally incorrect understanding of what the problem is. And let me explain what I mean by that. So, for instance, there is a lot of emphasis on foreign state actors and their influence operations. And this concern, as you might recall, came to the fore after reports of Russian meddling back in the 2016 election. And in many civil society circles, it's almost an article of faith that Trump won because of Russian influence. But there is research on this. It's taken a long while. There was a paper in 2019, and there was one actually earlier this year, really big, rigorous studies. And what that research shows is that any impact of Russian social media influence on people's attitudes or voting behavior, if it exists, is undetectably small. There is really, as far as we can tell, based on the best evidence, no truth to that claim. And in fact, we know from extensive political science research that people are very, very resistant to persuasion, even by candidates with big war chests. So this idea that a bunch of clumsy bots on social media could have changed the results of an election, it's such an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence, and there is no evidence behind it. And yet it has proven to be so sticky. And I think the reason it's so sticky is that it plays neatly into people's mental models of what the misinformation problem is, of what the disinformation problem is. And in particular, it's very convenient to name, look at these adversaries and to put the blame on them rather than face up to the facts that misinformation, or what we consider misinformation, is coming from us, from our fellow citizens. And I think that is the inconvenient truth. That is, I think, the core misunderstanding behind the efforts so far to ensure social media information integrity. There's a related factor here, another reason why social media platforms' efforts have faltered. They're mostly looking at the supply side of misinformation. So there's a supply side and a demand side. The supply side is things like people who are tweeting fake news just to make a buck, or political partisans who want their side to win, or foreign influence operations, and all these widely talked about things. So that's the supply side. And what's the demand side? The demand side is people who have certain worldviews and will find any information, even if one source is closed up, will find another source of information that conforms to those worldviews. And depending on what those worldviews are, that information in question might often be misinformation, or what will be considered misinformation by people with other worldviews. So I think the interventions so far have not really looked at the demand side. They're mostly looking at the supply side and trying to cut off particular sources of supply, and even narrower than that, looking at individual instances of misinformation rather than looking at this broader social phenomenon. And when we look at these worldview differences, we know very well what the root causes are that leads people to be, consumers of misinformation, and that's political polarization and the decline of trust in institutions. Those are the two main ones that I think are the causes here. Those are the elephants in the room. They're the dinosaurs in the room. And I think it's absurd to talk about mis and disinformation. Misinformation, by the way, is information that is false, but without necessarily an intent to deceive. Disinformation is information that is not only false, but is propagated with an intent to deceive or harm. And we can't really talk about this without acknowledging these root causes. And when we design interventions without looking at those root causes, they end up being counterproductive. The perfect example of this, thinking about the decline of trust in institutions, because social media companies themselves are institutions in our society with low trust, they knew that if they were to be the arbiters of what is true and what is false, that would have no legitimacy. And so instead, they turned to third-party fact checkers. One would hope, and I assume they hoped, that this would increase the legitimacy of the process. But funnily enough, what happened was kind of the opposite. The concept of third-party fact-checking itself has now become partisan and has undergone a massive decline of trust in the last few years. So I think we don't have very good ideas about how to treat these deep wounds in our society, and so it's tempting to view it as a social media problem. And when the next shiny thing like generative AI comes along, it's tempting to think that that's really the problem. And if only we could put the tech back in the box. So in my view, social media is, it's a small part of the problem, but it's a significant part of the problem. And when it comes to generative AI, I think there is no truth to the idea that we have much to fear from bad actors who are going to use generative AI for disinformation. I think that's a complete boogeyman. And here's another way to look at it. So when I think about a disinformation campaign or just more organic misinformation, I see three phases. The first phase is generating false information. The second phase is distributing it to a somewhat large audience. And the third phase is persuading people in those groups or communities or what have you to actually believe that information. And let's look at each of these three stages and look at what technology has to do with each of them. Generative AI is primarily about making the generation of bad information easier. That's really the main place where it has a role. And when it comes to the distribution of misinformation, social media is very relevant. And when it comes to persuasion, this one's really interesting. I don't think these technologies are really helping with the persuasion aspect of it at all. So when I look at research, including done by my CITP colleague Alice Morwick, who is looking at communities on the far right in particular, who are creating these alternate beliefs, what she is finding is that it is the community membership that is so important. It happens gradually over a period of years. As a person becomes inculcated in a community, their identity changes, and gradually, as part of that process, their beliefs change. So what we're seeing here is the costly part of misinformation is the persuasion. Somewhat less costly, but also important, is the distribution. And really the least important of all is the generation of misinformation. The cost of that was already pretty close to zero. And that's why I think generative AI has changed nothing. Social media is important, but is still not the most important factor. If the internet has had an important role to play in misinformation, it is simply this process of allowing these communities to come together for the supply and demand for misinformation to find each other. So I think it's a really low-tech way in which the internet has primarily had an impact, if it has had an impact at all. So I don't want to cast these new internet-enabled communities in a purely negative light. Of course, there are communities like QAnon, but there is a whole spectrum. On the other end of that spectrum are communities like Wikipedia. And in the middle, there are many types of subreddits. And what all of these share in common is that they have come up with new ways of creating or curating information. They are new epistemic communities. Their epistemic norms are very different from what we're used to in traditional institutions like academic scholarship. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. So I want to, in the last couple of minutes, zoom out beyond misinformation a little bit and look at the relationship between what I call these new epistemic communities and us, kind of the epistemic elite. So the word elite has been used in both the previous talks. I'm using it in a slightly different way. I'm using the term epistemic elite. So these are the institutions like academia and science, scholarship, public health, the news media, these are the traditional ways of understanding, what we believe about the world. And, these communities continue to have a lot of reputation in the world, but I want to ask, what is the relationship between them and these new communities? And I want to claim that the epistemic elites have largely turned up our noses at these new communities. And I want to name that as the root of one of the problems, and to adopt some language that was used earlier by Pratap, I think, I would consider that a betrayal of our mission. And let me explain what I mean. We have, I think, failed to engage meaningfully with any of these communities. We had an opportunity to participate in these communities, to bring to those communities what we know about how to produce reliable knowledge, and to, in turn, learn from them. We did not do that. And in the absence of this engagement, all of these new epistemic communities have gone their own way. And when their methods of knowledge production are so different, it should be no surprise that the truths that they come to are sometimes different from our truths. And rather than understand these new ways of knowledge production, we have tried to subjugate them by treating it as misinformation. So that's the frame we have used, and I argue that that frame is fundamentally wrong. And beyond that, when information propagates at the speed of social media, when there is a demand whenever a new issue comes up, there is intense demand from the public for answers. And those of us who are trained in more reliable ways of producing knowledge, which has its own pace and cadence that takes years, we look at this tension, and what we've done, by and large, I think, is simply refuse to engage. And I think that's a problem. And when there's a vacuum of reliable information, we shouldn't be surprised when these new communities go ahead and fill these gaps in a way that best suits their methods and their beliefs and their practices. So to borrow from Steve, he framed it as a progressive intolerance of reasonable dissent. I love that framing, and I think this intolerance is further eroding trust in institutions, which I think is one of the root causes here, and institutions including science and public health and the media. And as that goes on, this decline of trust is breeding further dissent, so misinformation as dissent, perhaps, in addition to misinformation qua misinformation and misinformation as reasonable disagreement. So those are maybe three related ways of looking at it. And so as that dissent deepens, we seem to be spiraling towards something, and I genuinely don't know what that end state is. So to conclude, the message that I want to give is that if mainstream epistemic institutions want to do about what we call the misinformation problem, I think we should start by looking at ourselves and seeing how we can change our epistemic practices. Thank you very much.
A little under 10 minutes. I'm going to invite Arvind and Steve to come up to the front. Tom, I don't know if you can hear us. I'm going to stay on the side and take questions. Maybe we can take 2 or so questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Can we hear it? Can they hear? Can they see?
They should be able to hear. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Yes.
So I sympathize with a lot of the arguments, and Steve, I agree with your points that some of those quotes you had there, those even as a non-scientist, one could see that those are claims that are contestable. So you guys have been talking about truth-seeking institutions. But some of these institutions are not just truth-seeking, but they're also truth-bearing institutions. So when I listen, for example, to, let's say, a professor on a media speaking to an issue within an area of his expertise or her expertise, I don't simply listen to that as information. I also listen to that as knowledge. I also listen to it as the truth, because it comes from what you refer to as these epistemic elites. When I listen to Fauci, I don't simply listen to what he says as information that is subject to verification. It is the truth. It is something I have to act on. So in the context of a public health emergency, when you have 2 groups, individuals, epistemic elites providing conflicting information, isn't it reasonable to have government to have the power to use proportionate authority to somewhat regulate speech. I know in the US context it's slightly different, but I think the discussion kind of misses the context of a public health emergency when, yes, the government itself and scientists don't know much, but still, isn't it better to have, one epistemic elite or epistemic community guiding the way instead of having radically contrasting information?
Okay, thank you so much. My question is for Pratap, and Pratap, I don't know whether you can see me. This is Evgeny. I think you ended with the threat of nationalism. I'm sorry if I couldn't catch it all because we couldn't hear you properly. My question is, what actually can we do about this threat? I mean, there must be a difference with nationalists already in office who we can protest and, exert all kinds of pressures. And there are nationalists who are aspiring to office. And what would be, protection measures for free speech against those movements who are not yet in office, but aspiring to office? What kind of threat they represent, and how can we mitigate it?
Thanks. So I just wanted to say ×2 to the nationalism debate, but also, Arvind, you said you're basically calling for academia to change its pace and cadence to keep up with society. And I don't know if you've already thought through what that could look like and how academia could more effectively engage.
Sure, thank you. When I'm calling for change in academia, I'm very much acknowledging that producing truth in the way we produce truth, it's a very deliberate process. It takes a long time, and that, of course, can't be rushed, and we can't produce high-quality knowledge in the way that we do in a matter of weeks rather than years. I understand very much that that's unrealistic. However, the types of engagement that are calling for are perhaps less to do with knowledge itself and more to do with the methods of producing knowledge. In terms of the methods, there has been so little interchange between these communities, I feel. I think we have a lot to learn from non-academic communities, for instance, in the way that some of them synthesize knowledge. I'm reminded of the parable of the fox and the hedgehog. The idea is that the hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many small things. And when experts like Philip Tetlock have looked at which of these styles of using information to predict the future does well, it turns out to be the foxes. In academia, I think we're hedgehogs. We're highly deep into our own disciplines. And I think we have a lot to learn from many non-academic communities about how to take uncertain knowledge from many areas and put it together into something that is not necessarily bulletproof, but a kind of best effort synthesis of the knowledge available so far. So since I work in tech policy, I find myself doing a lot of this. And what I draw from is so rarely from academia because we don't do that. And I think it's not just us engaging and giving something to those communities, but also learning in turn.
Pratap?
Thanks again for that question. Quick response obviously requires a much broader discussion. So, one, I just put nationalism on the table for two reasons. One, because it's the one ideology that is being invoked to justify legal restrictions on freedom of expression more than almost any other case of this kind. And second, if you actually look at the generation of content in some senses that is harmful to democracy and all that what are we as citizens supplying, a large chunk of that is actually somehow traces, at least in our context, to, I think, nationalist impulses in some ways. There's a kind of narcissism associated with it, which impedes any consideration of empathy, equality, consideration of the other, standard things that we think of as central to democratic practices. And that I actually think is broadly right, which is that if you take out that from the picture, then actually the dangerous content story doesn't look at least as ominous, I think, to my mind, I think, as it does in the context of nationalism. What can we do about it? I honestly cannot give you an answer. I think we are both in different contexts puzzling, in some senses over this. What are the social and economic and ideological circumstances, right, under which these kinds of ideologies, at least the most aggressive face of it, becomes attractive to large numbers of people, or at least and particularly significant sections of the elite. I honestly will pass on this one because it might take too long to give a meandering answer. But that is exactly, I think, the political question of our times, that in some senses, if you want to save democracy and free expression, in part you'll have to save democracies from excessive nationalism.
So thank you for the question. You said during a public health crisis, we need scientific authority and we need to trust scientific authority. And you mentioned Anthony Fauci, who said, indeed, if you distrust me, you distrust science, effectively saying, I am the science. And indeed, there's a strong hierarchy in public health, probably because the NIH is the main funder and they have a lot of power. But I think we need to, that is the blue state Democratic partisan viewpoint. There were dissenting viewpoints, dissenting from Fauci and the mainstream. Ron DeSantis invited Bhattacharya and Kuldorf to go down to Florida and consult. He read their articles and asked questions. That was taken down by YouTube. The video of the seminar, effectively, they held as misinformation. I completely agree with Arvind that we're living in different epistemic bubbles, and us elites live in our own epistemic bubble that has a strong partisan coloration and a strong, I think, elite bias. Education levels are strongly associated with the Democratic Party now, Democratic partisanship, and lower levels of education associated with Republican partisanship. Trump is winning over significant numbers of working class voters. So I completely agree that we need to engage constructively without people outside of our epistemic bubbles. And that means, I think, in universities, in part, we need more viewpoint diversity. We're too uniformly progressive. And I think we should be taking that more seriously, lest we contribute to distrust in our institutions by virtue of our obtuseness to concerns coming from the political right, some of which are reasonable. The only thing I'd say against Pratap is I think that nationalism in India has been a terrible force, but not all forms of nationalism are equally disreputable or immoral. So I would just say that there are concerns on the political right that need to be taken more seriously, including in universities, if we want to try to be worthy of trust, and whether actual trust will increase. So that's what I would say.
Let me wrap this up with a recognition that it's impossible to wrap up this conversation. So I want to start off, first of all, by thanking our speakers. Let's just give them a warm round of applause for a really dynamic set of comments. The second thing I wanted to say is, I had no idea where this panel was going to go, and I have been both surprised and provoked, but also excited by the kinds of questions that are on the table. And I just wanted to note a few things, which is that even if we take freedom of speech, freedom of expression, free speech as a right and an aspirational goal, it raises all kinds of questions, especially in the context of fear and uncertainty. And I want to throw those words back in. I'm going to come back to the core themes I think that cut across, but in a context of fear and uncertainty, and the public health crisis is one of those, democracy might be another, there is this need to feel that there is some control. And so I think that part of the fear of free speech and the questions that are on the table are amplified in the context of fear and uncertainty, and all the more so, and here are the two themes that came through across all three of the talks, in the context of increasing distrust in one another and distrust in institutions, and in the context of polarization, of which certain kinds of nationalism, not all, particularly exacerbate this. So I want to thank our speakers for really pushing us to not only look at the global context, but also to challenge our own assumptions. I'm sure we'll continue to think about this going forward. So thanks again.
Deborah.